Good evening. Tonight, I'd like to do something a little bit different and do a little tutorial on modular synthesis and making your sequences more interesting. Now, I know a lot of people I've spoken to have expressed an interest in modular. Some are starting to dip their toes in, some have been there for a while, others are perhaps a little bit daunted. Now, I've been working with software modular, particularly VCV Rack, which is free for the most part, for about 4 years, and I've picked up a few tips and tricks along the way, and I can tell you that it's the most amazing way to make music because it's basically Lego for synthesis. It's absolutely fantastic, and it's not anywhere near as difficult. It has a fairly steep learning curve to begin with, but after a while, you seem to move on to a different level where you start to solve problems. And that's what I really like about it. It keeps me challenged. So, as I said, I'd like to talk you through some tips that I've acquired. And I didn't create any of these myself. I've acquired them from people like Omri Cohen, who's a real modular guru for VCV Rack. And if you're at all interested in modular synthesis, you should really watch Omri Cohen's videos. They are very, very enjoyable, and he's a superb teacher. So, without further ado, let's see what we have. Now, to begin with, what we've got here is your standard synth voice. You have an oscillator, which has an envelope modulating the VCA. The oscillator goes into the filter. The filter goes into the VCA. The VCA is, as you can see, being triggered by the envelope. And the envelope is being gated or clocked. So when there's a gate, the envelope fires. And the pitch is coming from the first row of the sequencer. Now you recognise this, it looks a little bit different, but it is basically the Moog 960 sequencer, 3 rows, you can cut steps out and so on, but in this case we're not going to do too much. It's an 8-step sequencer, we're only interested in the first row. The first row is throwing pitches to the quantizer into the oscillator and out the other side. So this is what it sounds like. Now, that's not particularly inspiring because it's only one note. So we take the steps up. So it's now playing the first 2 steps and up to the 3rd step, and we get into fairly familiar territory. Now you've been listening to this for almost 50 years and you're not inside out yourself. And that's your standard Berlin School 8-step sequence. You know, we can reduce the steps for a bit more interest. But beyond that, there's not really much you can do to make your sequence interesting. Yes, we can add delays and so on, but we're talking about the actual generation of notes here. Now over here we've got something called a Bernoulli gate, which I'll explain in a minute. It's basically a probability generator. If you see what I've done there, as soon as I plug that in, this is now ratcheting 100% of the notes that are coming in. Now I'm going to turn this down a bit. And now it's ratcheting roughly 50% of them. If I turn it right down, there are no more ratchets. So that makes your sequence more interesting, but it doesn't really affect much more than the rhythm of the notes. Still using the same 8 notes in the same order. So while it's fabulous, I think we need a bit more interest. Now, in this particular tutorial, I'm going to be focusing on these 2 modules above all others. As I've seen, the Bernoulli gate generates probability. And what happens is that you send a clock to it. It will fire either left or right, A or B. When this is up, it will fire B 100%. B is denoted by a green light. If we take it to 50%, it will flash red as well as green. A, of course, is red. If we take it to the left, which is 0%, then B has a probability of 0, whereas A has a probability of 100. Now, what's happening is it's a coin toss algorithm. So at every trigger, it decides whether it will go left or right. Now, this biases the probability. It's only balanced at 50%. So I find this an incredibly useful module. And it appears in every single one of my patches, usually half a dozen times. The second module I want to talk about now is the sequential switch. Now, the sequential switch is a fantastic little module. And what it does is basically that, it switches between sequences. Now, you send a clock to it, it will send, you have elements plugged in here. For example, if I do that, then every time the light flashes here, it will send out that particular sequence. Now, I'll explain more in a minute when we plug some sequences in, but you'll notice that it's jumping between these 3 yellow lights sequentially. We can have 4 or we can have 2. I'm going to stick to 3 because we're going to use the same Moog 960 type sequencer for all of the examples, so you get to see fairly quickly what's going on. Now, here's the clock and the mixing. There's a delay and a reverb over towards the side, but we're not really too fussed with that. So if we take our next sequence, which is this one here, and that's running the bass line. Now, at the moment, there is only one step. We can turn that step up. We can turn it down. We can turn that up to 8. But it's still the same situation we had before. So what we're going to do this time is keep it at 8, but go to the Bernoulli gate. And the Bernoulli gate is currently playing all the notes all of the time. So I'm going to take the Bernoulli gate and start to move it down. So now, as you can hear, you're getting a broken rhythm. Still playing the same notes. Now, what's great about the Bernoulli gate is it will keep the sequence exactly the way it was. It doesn't reverse the order or change the order. It just leaves out some of the notes. So now it's playing roughly 50% of the notes, but it's still playing them in the same order. Okay, so that's a change now. Not particularly helpful in its own, but if we bring in some drums, which are down here, all of a sudden the bass sequence acquires much more rhythmical interest. So that's the first trick, is to use a Bernoulli gate to thin out the sequence, unless you want to play the full thing. So the next trick is to take the sequential switch. Now at the moment, we're on voice number 2, so I'll scroll this up a little bit. We're on this one here, it's only playing the first note, but you'll hear the pitch changes. Now the reason for that is the switch is being clocked at a clock rate of 1/6 of the master clock. So it will play 6 steps and then it will move on. Now, what will it move on to? Well, here are the 3 pitch outputs. And the 3 pitch outputs, 1, 2 and 3, go into the 3 inputs of the sequential switch. And what happens is that it will play the first note 6 times, then the second note 6 times, then the third note 6 times, and then it will revert back to the beginning. Now that's possibly an improvement, but as you can hear, it's not very much of an improvement. So as we turn the number of steps up, you'll hear the difference. And what it's doing now is it's going to play these two notes 3 times for a total of 6, then these two notes 3 times, then these two notes 3 times. And we go on. And now it's playing 3 notes twice, 3 notes twice, 3 notes twice. Now it gets more interesting when we move up to the 4th step. So what it's doing is it's playing 4 and then 2 and then jumping to 2 and then 4 and then jumping to 4 and then 2 before it jumps back here. So we get an evolving sequence over a number of steps, and the more steps you add, the more evolved the sequence becomes. Now it will repeat itself depending on the number of steps. It's easy-ish enough to work out when we can expect the sequence to go back to square one, and it will go back to square one and it will repeat, but it will repeat over a long period of time. So as you can hear, compared to the original that we had, this is a lot more interesting. But in this case, it's playing all of the notes. So we'll go back to using a Bernoulli gate to thin these notes out. So at the moment, as you can see, the Bernoulli gate's at 100%. If I turn it down, you get an unpredictable rhythm, but you still get an evolving sequence. Now, if I bring in the first sequence again, and those drums, this generates a lot of rhythmic interest as well as melodic interest. So I'll take them back out and we'll move on to voice number 3, which is down here. Now voice number 3 takes voice number 2 and moves it up a level. And what's happening here is that we have the same situation, the 8-step sequence with 3 rows. Now this time, instead of feeding them into the previous sequential switch, there's another sequential switch, which is this time at 8-to-1. Now, it doesn't really make a massive difference to from a 4-to-1 to an 8-to-1, except for one thing. This has a random input, and we're going to be clocking the random input. And as you can see, as it's being clocked, we're jumping randomly between these. Now, I've connected them up in no particular order, so it's not 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, etc. It's just a random order, and we're going to be flicking between them randomly. Now, what is important here? We only have one step, so I'll turn that up, let you hear it. We're only at one step, which means that we are only using the first column, which means also that we only have 3 notes to choose from. So if you listen carefully, you'll hear the same 3 notes being repeated randomly. Now, when we take that up to 2 steps, we double the number of notes that we have, so of course the sequence becomes much more interesting, and so on. I don't know if you follow in the pattern in the sequential switch, but you will find that it quite often jumps between the same 2 steps, And that is total random. Random doesn't mean it's a different step each time. Random means you can have repetition as well as jumping anywhere. So as we get up to an 8-step sequence, we're using all 24 notes, which we can be jumping between. And then if we take the Bernoulli gate, again, they're all still playing every single note, but we take the Bernoulli gate and thin it down a bit. And then bring in the previous two. Now on their own, these sequences are not especially interesting. But when you start to layer them, again we'll bring in the drums. Now, the thing to notice is that all of these are using the C minor pentatonic. In other words, there are only 5 notes. I haven't used an entire scale. So there's quite a lot that you can do with only 5 notes. Okay, so let's move on. Now this time, this is something entirely different. There's a little module here called Utilities. Now, this is based on a module by Mutable Instruments called Kinks. And what I really like about this is that you can feed in the output of 2 sequences and it will play 2 notes. One will be the maximum highest note and the other one will be the minimum, the lowest note. And you can feed this to one voice and this one to the other voice. And so what you get are 2 connected sequences. And if you're running this, I haven't done here, but you can be running this from elsewhere in your patch and it gives you another 2 sequencer voices without having to use another 2 sequencers. So this is particularly useful in hardware. And I should point out that all of these tricks are hardware based as well as software based. So I'll bring in voice number 4 first of all. Now again, there's only one step. Now voice number 4 is coming from sequence 1 and sequence 2. And they're both going into the quantizers, and the quantizers are feeding their output to the logic section here, and the maximum is going into voice number 1. Now this is voice number 1. Now this is an FM operator, it's just a nice FM voice. You can hear. So as we increase the number of steps, again, if you're looking at this section here, it's taking these 6 notes and in each column picking the higher of the 3, so you get a repetitive sequence. So as we go up a bit further, now that's useful, and it's useful because it fills in against the backdrop of and it fills out the sound a little bit. But where this comes into its own, I think, is if we bring in voice number 5, the thing we're doing here, again, nothing particularly interesting about that. It's good, but it's not great, and it's certainly very repetitive. So we'll take it up to 8 steps. You get your standard 8-step sequence. Now, the Bernoulli gates here, these two are driving these two voices. So if I start to take voice 4 down a bit, and now voice 5, then the two sequences are interlinked with each other, which again makes it much more rhythmically interesting. And again, if we bring in the drums, and the originals, now if you remember, these Bernoulli gates are all somewhere between 0 and 100 in terms of percentage, so they will all be working and weaving in and out of each other. The thing about this is it takes you into a different musical area, and certainly a different rhythmic area, because we're no longer constrained by the linear sequencing of so many hardware sequencers. And it's not that we are generating randomness. What we are doing is we are selecting the type of rhythm and the gaps where we want the notes to overlap and interweave. And one final thing, there's a wee transposer down the bottom. Here's the drums, by the way. They're running Euclidean sequences, which I might talk about another time if there's any interest. But the transposition, all of the quantizers are transposable, and the way we do that is use a trigger. Obviously, you just press a button, but what's clever about this is that we use a trigger buffer. Now the trigger buffer receives a clock on every 4th beat, which means that even if you press this button, it won't fire the trigger until you're on the 4th beat. In other words, at the end or the beginning of a bar. So if we try that, you hear all the sequences transposed. Reset that now. Finally, I'll turn everything up. This is what it sounds like when every note is playing all the time. And what I like about this is you can slowly bring down your probabilities So you're coming into what appears to be a slower tempo, simply by thinning out the sequences. And you can thin out the drum sequences as well. I don't know if you're watching this section here, but I'm turning down the number of hits. So the drums can be thinned out as well. And we're almost reaching the point where hardly any notes are being triggered. And I find this a fantastic performance tool, where you're still getting the same sequences, you're just only getting a few notes of each one. As we take it down, and all that's happening here is the Bernoulli gate percentage has been turned down towards 0. So, there we go. Now, I hope that you have enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed running through it. It's by no means an in-depth overview of modular, but what it is, I think, is a way of expanding your musical horizons, which modular does for me every day. It takes you in all sorts of different directions, different journeys, and it helps you maintain mental agility, which at our age is absolutely priceless. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for watching, and I really appreciate you took the time to do so. I'll see you soon.